Hi, my name is Ben Winkler. This is my Unit 2 Student-Centered Assessment. And in the last unit, we talked about westward expansion and life in the West as, this time period evolved. But now we're going to talk about life in the East and what happened on this side of the country, because people had been living there for much longer, so they were subject to more urbanization. Now we're going to talk about the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age is a term coined by Mark Twain, and what gilded means is it means shiny on the outside and ugly on the inside. Now when you apply that term to America, you can see why people would think that we were shiny on the outside. We had titans with many riches. We had all this westward expansion. We had nationalism where we believed that it was our divine right to have the land from this ocean to this ocean, and it was ours. It was ours for the taking. We needed it as a nation. We had technology. We were advancing in technologies that some countries hadn't even begun to look into yet. Such as our Navy later on in the unit, and also we had Thomas Edison, who was a great inventor for us, and we also had the big cities and skyscrapers and urbanization and industrialization and all these big things that would make America seem so great and so shiny. But if you were an immigrant or if you were a tourist just coming in to the nation to see what it really was like, it wasn't all that it was cracked out to be. You had corrupt businesses, you had these monopolies, you had poor people, you had horrible working conditions for immigrants and other poor citizens. There was no middle class. You were either rich or you were dirt poor. There was no in between. And rich people made sure that there was a big gap in between. So let's talk about some of these terms. We're going to talk about monopolies. Now, the term monopoly means that you own every aspect of a business. Nobody can go get your product from anywhere else but you. So let's take Carnegie as an example. Carnegie owned steel. He literally owned steel. If you wanted steel, you had to go through him. And since he owned every aspect of steel, he could raise the price to whatever he wanted, because you were the only one he was the only one you could get it from. So he could raise the price as high as he felt need. So what this did was it made him very rich, and it made steel only available to very rich people, such as the government, other titans, and other big corporations. You also have Carnegie, who owned oil. And Carnegie was very tight with the American government because we need oil as a government, to run our nation. So you have these big names controlling and, are very influential. And when I say influential, I don't mean just like, wow, that's a big, influence to America. I mean, like, these people literally corrupted, they corrupted elections. They got people into office that they wanted to get into office. They made sure that, if they wanted something done, it was getting done. Next thing we're going to talk about were the poor people, the lower class. Now, these lower class Americans were mostly immigrants, and what they did was they would come to the country and they would have nothing. They wouldn't have anything. So they would go to these big businesses, and the big businesses would give them jobs in factories. Very, meticulous jobs, hands-on on assembly lines and stuff like that. And they would have horrible work hours, horrible pay, horrible working conditions. Women and children had to work, and they were paid less. Women and children were paid less than men. And these children, they use children because children's hands are smaller and they can do more with these small hands. And oftentimes these children would get injured, trying to fix big machinery that they really shouldn't have been messing with in the first place. And so when we talk about women during this time period, the main thing that comes to my mind is women's rights. During this time period, many women fought for women's suffrage. Now, what this means is that women wanted the right to vote. immigrants who would come to this country and become citizens could vote. Immigrants who didn't even live in our country could vote. But these women who were born, raised, thoroughbred Americans, they couldn't vote at all. So they were a little upset, and finally we passed the 19th Amendment allowing women to vote for office. Back to these poor, working conditions, we're going to talk about labor unions. Now, these workers would come together and fight for better working conditions, and they would unionize into a labor union. And they would fight, and they would stop working, they would go on strike and say, we're not going to work until we have shorter hours, better pay, and better working conditions. Now, this often ended violently. For example, the Knights of Labor was ended by the Haymaker Riot, and that ended violently with bombs, gunshots. A couple people were killed. There were a lot of violent riots, and that wasn't the only one. There were a lot. Oftentimes, these big corporations would hire private police forces to come in and break up riots, and all this means is they would hire, a private police force would come in and just shoot up the riots just to break them up, just to get rid of all these people from striking. Or oftentimes when people went on strike and they unionized, the big corporation would just fire them all and hire in other immigrants who would work and who would do the job. And so all these big monopolies are controlling, and they're keeping the gap between the rich and the poor very, very high, and they're very, very wide. There was no middle class whatsoever. Now, these monopolies, a lot of them were broken up by the Antitrust Act. And what this is a monopoly is a trust. So the Antitrust Act would break up a monopoly and keep any one business from owning an entire area of business. So, like, let's say